Welcome to my channel. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and like. The wind on Clyros 4 didn't just blow, it howled. Red dust storms lashed against the metal hull of the abandoned research station, as if the universe itself were trying to tear apart every trace of life. Elias Voss tightened the scarf over his face, eyes squinting behind fogged goggles, red sand clinging to him like a second skin. The sound of sand striking his helmet was like the whispers of ghosts, calling his name in the crimson night. Elias! Elias! 7 years alone, wandering through the ruins of a failed mining project, had made him accustomed to sounds that weren't real. They were echoes of those who had once been here, those he had called comrades, now just memories buried beneath the sand. But tonight something was different, a faint pulse, fragile, cutting through the wind's screech, like a heart struggling to cling to life in the darkness. Elias tightened the strap of his survival pack, the leather rubbing against his aching shoulder, where an old scar from a reactor explosion still throbbed. He stepped over a row of rusted conduits, now mere metal bones half buried in the sand. The light from his shoulder lamp flickered, weak as a candle in a gale, illuminating fragments of automated drills, corpses of technology, abandoned when the mining corporation fled after the war. Clyros 4 forgave nothing. This planet devoured hope as it devoured lost ships, grinding them into red dust and memories. Elias wasn't out here for gold or fuel. He was out here because if he stopped, if he sat in the wreckage of his dying ship, he'd have to face the truth. There was nothing left to live for, except his own stubbornness. He leaned to avoid a jagged steel beam protruding from the rubble, sand crunching under his worn boots. Night swallowed the last light from Clyros' twin suns, leaving a blood-red veil, with only his shoulder lamp to fend off the dark. Elias entered an old tunnel, once a conduit for ore transport, now a corridor of death, its walls crumbling, reeking of burnt metal. His lamp swept across cracks, shattered cargo crates, and faint traces of what might have been dried blood, but he didn't stop to check. He was scavenging for a power core, a superconductor coil, or just a piece of metal good enough to patch his failing ship. Every trip was a gamble, and Elias had lost too many times to hope for miracles. But then, a sound stopped him. Not the wind hissing through crevices, not the groan of metal under the storm's pressure. A faint moan, weak, like a stifled breath, as if someone were clinging to life with their last ounce of strength. Elias froze, every sense on edge. He turned slowly, his lamp sweeping the tunnel's shadowed corner, where sand had piled into a small mound, like a hasty grave. There, beneath the fine dust, was a figure. Not human. A slender form, curled tight like a child bracing against death. Pale blue skin shimmered like pearl under his light, but it was fading, delicate veins like silver threads dimming in the cold. Thin arms clutched her chest, short nails clawing at a tattered coat, as if she were trying to hold on to the last scraps of warmth. Elias didn't think. He lunged forward, knees slamming into the sand, crunching like breaking bones. He knelt beside her, his lamp casting clearer light. Not a hallucination. Not a memory. She was real, but not human. Her thin coat, torn at the shoulder, revealed faint white scars, marks of cold and starvation. Her eyes were half closed, lids trembling, revealing pale gold pupils, bright as distant stars, but that light was fading, like a fire about to die. Elias stripped off his thermal jacket, the only thing keeping him warm in Clyros 4's bone-cutting cold, patched dozens of times with wire and emergency sealant. He wrapped it around her, his movements gentle but urgent, as if time were slipping away by the second. Her skin was cold as stone, bones sharp beneath her thin flesh, so prominent he felt them through his gloves. "Hey!" he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse, like gravel scraping together. "Can you hear me?" No response. Not a blink, not a stronger breath. Only a faint exhale, like a fragile thread about to snap. He touched her shoulder, checking for signs of life. Her pulse, if she had one, was so slow it was barely there. Elias cursed under his breath, not at the situation, but at his own helplessness. He had no medicine, no medical gear, just instinct and a handful of survival supplies. He glanced around, the wind howling through the tunnel's mouth like a warning. The storm was growing stronger, and if he didn't move fast, they'd both be buried. He lifted her, light as a dried leaf, her body almost weightless, but each step he took was heavy, as if he carried both their fates. The wind screamed in his ears, red sand lashing his face, as if trying to snatch her from his arms. He held her tighter, one arm locked under her knees, the other cradling her back, stepping over debris toward his ship, half a mile away. Every step was a battle. Sand clung to his boots, making him slip, the wind pushing him back, as if Clyro's 4 refused to release its prey. Elias gritted his teeth, his breath misting in the cold. He didn't know who she was, didn't know if she'd survive, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let her die here, not in the sand, not alone. His ship loomed in the darkness, a warped heap of metal half buried in sand, but still the only place he called home. The airlock hissed open, emergency lights flashing red, like the pulse of a dying machine. Elias stepped inside carrying her, carrying a fragile spark of hope that tonight, at least, death wouldn't win. Elias's ship, an old transport vessel stranded in a storage bay, was no longer a home. It was a tomb with a heartbeat, a rusted wreck with walls that groaned under the pressure of Clyro's 4's sandstorms. The airlock hissed open, metal scraping like the cry of a dying machine. Emergency lights flickered red, casting a dim glow over the faded control panel, which read 3 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze blood without heat. Elias stepped inside, carrying the nameless girl, her slender frame so light she felt almost unreal in his arms. He laid her on the narrow bunk, the only intact thing in the sleeping quarters, a tattered cloth draped over a cold metal frame. Her skin, pale blue, shimmered faintly under the light, like a forgotten gem in the sand. He knelt, checking her breathing. A thin mist escaped her lips, weak as a whisper, but still there. Elias rummaged through the storage locker, fingers trembling from cold and adrenaline. He pulled out his last thermal blanket, a relic he'd clung to through countless storms, worth 2 months of rations on the black market. It was his ticket to survival, something he could trade for fuel or food to stretch a few more weeks. But he didn't hesitate. He draped the blanket over her, pulling it tight around her shoulders, ensuring no gap let the cold slip in. Her skin was still stone cold, but her breathing seemed deeper, as if the blanket were a tether pulling her back from the brink. Elias stood, his legs aching from the trek through the storm. He activated the control panel, fingers brushing over the cracked screen, fractures spiderwebbing across it. The black market connection was still active, though faint, the signal flickering like the pulse of a dying man. He opened the inventory, eyes scanning the flashing text: power cores, synthetic rations, superconductor coils. A new heating core, priced at 320 credits, glared like a challenge. He had 350 credits, all that remained after 7 years of scraping through ruins. That money could buy fuel for a short flight, enough to reach a nearby space station, or a week of rations to stave off starvation. He glanced at her, her faint breath misting, her pale gold eyes closed, like stars veiled by clouds. 3 seconds. He pressed confirm. The credits vanished, the screen flickered once and went dark, as if the ship itself sighed in relief. 20 minutes later, a screech sounded from the delivery slot. A drone dropped a package, its outer casing frosted from atmospheric friction, steam rising like smoke. Elias rushed over, tearing open the shell, hands shaking from cold and haste. Inside was the heating core, small but heavy, its metal surface gleaming like a promise. He activated it, a soft hum rising, and placed it under the blanket, near her chest. He carefully tucked a cloth between her skin and the core to prevent burns, his fingers brushing her neck. She stirred faintly, lips parting, but no words came, only a weak sound, like wind slipping through a crevice. "Take it slow," he said, kneeling beside her, his voice rough as gravel. "You're safe now." He pulled the blanket tighter, ensuring she was fully enveloped, as if he could will her to live. Her breathing slowed, deepened, no longer ragged. Her hands, no longer clenched, rested on the blanket, slender fingers relaxed, no longer clawing at her coat as they had when he found her. Elias sat on the floor, leaning against the opposite wall, the metal biting through his thin shirt. His body ached, his skin raw where sand had slipped through gaps in his armor. He opened his survival pack, pulling out a ration bar, its dry, tasteless bulk just enough to keep him alive. He took a bite, the metallic tang of synthetic flour mixing with grit, then placed the rest near her hand, on the bunk's edge, just within reach if she woke. He didn't know if she could eat it, didn't know what she needed, but it was all he had. Outside, the storm still raged, red sand hammering the ship's hull like tiny bullets. Inside, only the soft hum of the heating core remained, like the heartbeat of a living machine. Elias watched her, her delicate features not quite human, yet strangely beautiful, like a forgotten dream. Her long black hair, shimmering like spilled oil, slid off the bunk, catching the faint orange light. Her pale gold eyes, though closed, seemed to hold a story he couldn't read. Who was she? Why was she here, barefoot, without gear, with only a torn coat and faint white scars on her skin? A scientist, a fugitive, or just another victim of Clyro's 4 like him? He had no answers, but her presence, fragile as it was, had shattered the deadly stillness of his 7 years of solitude. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion crashing over him like a heavy wave, relentless and inescapable. The floor was freezing, but he didn't care. He could sleep right here, against the wall, as he had so many nights. But tonight he didn't want to. Not because he feared she'd vanish, but because he wanted to be sure she'd live through the night. He watched her, her breathing steadier, the blue of her skin faintly brighter, as if the heating core wasn't just warming her body but awakening something deeper within. Elias tilted his head, wondering if she dreamed, and if so, what, of a home, a planet without storms, or just surviving one more night. He didn't know, but for the first time in 7 years, he felt a small spark, not from his shoulder lamp, not from the heating core, but from his own choice. Maybe she would live. And maybe, just maybe, he would too. When Elias woke, the ship's cabin was colder than he remembered, the chills seeping through his thin shirt like tiny blades. The heating core rattled, its faint orange light flickering on the walls, like a dying flame. He opened his eyes, his mind foggy, chest heavy from a fitful sleep on the metal floor. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, the storm, the tunnel, the girl with pale blue skin. But she was still there, lying under the thermal blanket, her long black hair shimmering like spilled oil, spilling over the pillow like a river of night flowing through the dark. Her skin, pale blue, now held a hint of warmth, no longer the ashen pallor of when he'd found her in the sand. Faint white scars on her arms and neck stood out, a map of days gnawed by cold and hunger, but she was alive. To Elias, that was a small victory. He sat up, his back creaking, each vertebra protesting the night spent on the freezing floor. The floor was no ideal bed, but he hadn't wanted to take the bunk. She needed it more, needed every scrap of warmth the faltering heating core could provide. Elias stood, his legs numb, and shuffled to the small storage nook in the corner. He rummaged, hands brushing rusted metal boxes, until he found his last canister of nutrient fluid. He poured the thick, syrupy liquid into a heating mug, mixing in a pinch of synthgrit, a cheap, metallic-tasting powder packed with enough calories to keep a person alive. He set the mug on the heater, the tiny flame crackling, releasing a faint metallic smell, not appetizing, but the best he had. 7 years had taught him not to be picky. When he turned back, her eyes were open. Not wide, just a narrow slit, glowing gold like stars, so bright they stopped him in his tracks. Those eyes weren't friendly, weren't welcoming, but cautious, like a wounded animal sizing up the figure before it. Elias paused, keeping his distance, not wanting to scare her. "Can you sit up?" he asked, his voice soft, like speaking to an old friend, though he knew she wasn't. No response. She only blinked, slowly, each movement seeming to cost effort. He offered the mug of nutrient fluid, holding it carefully with both hands, a gesture of peace. She looked at the mug, then at him, her golden eyes sweeping over his face, searching for any hint of deceit. She propped herself up, shoulders trembling under the blanket. The blanket slipped, revealing her tattered coat, faint white scars on her arms like dried riverbeds. She took the mug, her hands so cold Elias felt it through the metal, as if Clyro's forest chill had seeped into her bones. She sipped, her throat moving visibly, as if it were her first drink in days. Then another sip, faster, too eager, making her cough, the mug tilting. Elias steadied it before it spilled, his movement quick but gentle. She flinched, her golden eyes flashing, tense as a taut string. "I'm not doing anything," he said, his voice even, eyes meeting hers, unflinching. "Just didn't want you to spill." She stared at him, not trusting, but the panic in her eyes eased, like waves receding from a shore. He released the mug, letting her drink again, slower, more careful. Elias sat on the bunk's edge, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't feel threatened. "I'm Elias," he said after a moment's silence, his voice hoarse but clear. "Elias Voss, former ship engineer. Now just a survivor, trying not to let Clyros swallow me whole." She didn't respond, just drank, her eyes fixed on the mug as if it were a treasure, each sip a step back from the dark. He didn't press her. He knew silence, knew it could be heavy as sand, but also a refuge. He stood, walking to the heating core, checking the small display. 21% power. Not enough for another night. He cursed under his breath, fingers gripping the panel's edge. Without the core, the cold would kill them before the storm passed. He glanced at her, still sitting, her breathing steadier, but her body still fragile, like a candle in the wind. He returned, sitting on the floor a few steps away. "Got a name?" he asked, his voice soft, not expecting an answer. She paused, her fingers trembling on the mug, as if the question had touched something deep within her. She looked down, then slowly reached out, her slender fingers brushing the dust on the wall beside the bunk. She wrote, each stroke shaky but clear, "Silra." Elias read it aloud, his voice echoing in the quiet cabin. "Silra." She didn't nod, didn't smile, but her golden eyes softened, as if the name were a thread tying her to the world, an anchor in the storm. Elias repeated her name in his mind, a reminder that she wasn't just a victim of Clyros 4, but a person, a story, a reason to keep going. He leaned against the wall, eyes never leaving her. Silra finished the mug, setting it on the bunk's edge, her movements slow, as if testing her body. She pulled the blanket tighter, her golden eyes sweeping the cabin, from the flickering control panel to the cluttered corner. Elias wondered what she saw, a sanctuary, or a tomb, as he once had. Outside, the storm still roared, but inside the cabin, there was a new stillness, not of death, but of life, however fragile. Elias didn't know who she was, didn't know what secrets she carried, but those golden eyes, like stars in the dark, had kindled a spark in him, a spark he thought he'd lost long ago. Elias leaned against the wall, his gaze still on Silra. Her golden eyes, piercing the darkness like starlight, haunted him, a puzzle without an answer. Who was she, beyond the trembling name scrawled in dust? A scientist, a fugitive, or just another ghost of Clyros 4? He wanted to ask, to know what had brought her here, what made those eyes both resilient and pained. Outside, the howling wind softened, as if the planet were catching its breath, waiting. Elias closed his eyes, his breathing steadier, but within him, a small spark still burned, urging him to learn, not just to survive, but to understand. The storm eased by morning, but Clyros 4 was never truly silent. The wind still hissed through the ship's crevices, carrying the sound of sand scraping against the metal hull, like nails clawing at a slate. Elias woke to a faint noise, not the storm, but soft footsteps on the cabin floor. He opened his eyes, the weak orange glow of the heating core casting light on Silra's silhouette, standing by the dust-caked window, gazing out at the hazy red sand. She wore his thermal jacket, far too large, the sleeves swallowing her hands, but she stood upright, no longer trembling as she had the night before. Her slender frame exuded a quiet resolve Elias hadn't seen in his 7 years wandering among ruins. "Careful," he said, voice hoarse, sitting up from the freezing floor. "You're not fully recovered." Silra turned, her golden eyes blazing like twin flames in the dimness. I thought I'd die here, she said, her voice raspy but clear, carrying an alien cadence, like a bell ringing in the void, both gentle and sharp. Elias was startled, not because she spoke, but because she spoke common, the interstellar language he used, though tinged with an odd inflection, as if learned from a machine rather than a person. He stood, his back aching, and stepped closer, keeping enough distance to avoid startling her. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice low, not out of curiosity but as an invitation, like opening a door for her to step through. She tightened the blanket around her shoulders, her golden eyes sweeping the cabin, from the flickering control panel to the cluttered corner, as if weighing something. "I'm a biologist," she said, her voice not angry, just cold, as if she'd buried her emotions deep beneath the sand. "I studied Clyros's ecosystem before the war broke out. When the research station was abandoned, I was stranded. It wasn't an accident. They meant to leave me." Her words cut like a blade, each syllable a precise wound, but her eyes remained calm, like a still lake. Elias frowned, a chill settling over him, not from the cabin's cold but from what she'd said. "Who are they?" he asked, though part of him already knew. The mining corporation, the ones who'd turned Clyros 4 into a vast or pit before discarding it like a useless husk. Silra didn't answer immediately. She stepped to a corner of the cabin, kneeling beside a pile of discarded equipment, her hands sifting through rusted metal and severed cables. Elias watched, not interfering, sensing the care in her movements, as if she were handling something more precious than life itself. She pulled out a small, round device, no larger than her palm, gleaming like a jewel, its surface traced with silver circuits. She held it up, the device's light reflecting in her eyes, making them glow like twin stars. "A biological network beneath the sand," she said, her voice low but firm. "A living system, connecting the entire planet. It's not just plants or microbes. It's an energy grid capable of providing limitless power without mining, without destruction. It could change everything, how we live, how we build, how we survive." Elias stared at the device, small but heavy with meaning, like a stone holding the future. He'd seen data storage units before, repaired them as a ship engineer, but this was different. It wasn't just technology. It was a promise, a hope, and a curse. "Why didn't you send it out?" he asked, his voice low, trying to grasp why something so vital was buried with her in the sand. Silra gave a faint smile, devoid of joy, only bitterness. "I tried," she said, her fingers tightening around the device. "I sent a signal from the research station, but they cut the link. They erased my name from the records, erased my entire team, as if we never existed. I fled, but they found me, left me in that tunnel to die. All I had left was this." Her words swept through the cabin like a cold wind, carrying a truth Elias didn't want to face. Clyros 4 wasn't just an abandoned planet, but a secret guarded by blood. He stayed silent, stepping to the storage nook, pulling out a fresh canister of nutrient fluid. He popped the cap, handed it to her without a word. Silra took it, her hands still cold, but her eyes never left the device, as if it were the last piece of herself. She sipped, then set the canister down, her fingers tracing absent circles on its metal surface. Elias watched her, feeling the weight of what she carried, not just the device, but an unfinished fight. "Now I know," he said, his voice steady, though questions still churned within him. "And I won't let it stay buried." His words weren't empty promises. 7 years on Clyros 4 had taught him that survival wasn't just about breathing, it was about finding a reason to keep going. Silra, with her golden eyes and that small device, had given him that reason. She looked at him, her gaze sweeping his face, searching for a crack in his resolve. But she said nothing, only nodded slightly, a small gesture that lightened the cabin's heavy air. Elias stood, checking the control panel. The heating core was down to 20% power, and the black market signal had weakened, flickering like a dying lamp. Outside, red sand hung in the air, but the storm had calmed, leaving an eerie stillness. He glanced at Silra, still sitting, the device in her hands, her golden eyes like distant stars. He didn't know who she was, didn't know what they'd face, but for the first time in 7 years, he felt he wasn't just a survivor, but part of something greater. That device, and Silra herself, were a small flame in Clyros IV's darkness, and Elias was determined not to let it go out. The heating core died on the third night, its soft hum fading, leaving a terrifying silence in the cabin. The temperature plummeted to 0 degrees Celsius, the cold seeping through the ship's seams, clinging to skin like invisible claws. Elias woke, his breath misting, his body aching from sleeping on the floor. He looked at Silra, still on the bunk, her golden eyes glowing in the dark, her hands clutching the small device like a treasure. The core was dead, and they couldn't stay another night. The cold would kill them before the storm returned. "We have to move," he said, voice hoarse, standing to check his survival pack. "There's an old signal relay 10 miles from here, in the Sand Valley. If it's still working, we can transmit your data." Silra nodded, her gaze resolute despite her fragile frame, like a small flame defying Clyros IV's winds. Elias packed Silra's device, carefully wrapping it in cloth to shield it from sand. He stuffed in the last of the ration bars and a final energy stick, the only supplies left. Silra stood, his jacket draped over her shoulders, its long sleeves covering most of her hands, but she didn't complain. She tied back her hair, revealing faint white scars on her neck, and followed him to the airlock. Outside, red sand hung in the air, the wind lashing their faces like tiny blades. The trek was a nightmare. Sand clung to their boots, weighing each step, the wind pushing them back, as if Clyros IV refused to let them leave. Elias led, his goggles fogging with sand, his hand gripping a metal rod, his only weapon, a jagged piece of steel broken from an old drill, sharp but crude. Halfway, as they crossed a ridge of towering red rock, Elias stopped, his heart pounding. In the sand, under the faint light of the twin suns, were footprints, fresh, deep, not theirs. They were uniform, organized, not the tracks of wanderers or survivors. "Someone's here," he whispered, pulling Silra behind a rock, sand crunching under their knees. Through his goggles, he saw 3 figures, their light armor glinting in the red light, moving with the precision of predators. Not scavengers. Mercenaries. Elias gripped the metal rod, his knuckles widening. "We're being hunted," Silra said, her voice low, her golden eyes scanning the sandy haze. "They know I'm alive." Elias looked at her, seeing tension in her shoulders, but not fear. "They want the device?" he asked. She nodded, her hand instinctively touching the pack where it was hidden. "Or they want me silenced for good." They slipped through a narrow ravine, red sand coating their clothes, the wind howling in their ears like Clyros IV's laughter. Elias led, each step cautious, his eyes scanning every shadow, his ears straining for any sound. Silra followed close, her breathing steady but quick, her body still weak but her will unbroken. When they reached the Sand Valley, the signal relay loomed, a rusted steel tower teetering in a sea of sand, like a forgotten lighthouse. But as they approached, Elias cursed. The tower stood, but it was sabotaged, the main control panel smashed, cables spilling out like guts, some still faintly smoking. "Someone got here first," he said, his voice tight. Silra knelt, her hands brushing the cables, her golden eyes focused. "Not quite," she said. "There's a secondary circuit, deep inside. It's still active. Can you fix it?" Elias nodded, opening his tool pack, his hands shaking from cold and pressure. He knelt by the panel, pulling out old tools, a rusted screwdriver, small pliers, and a thin superconductor coil. He worked fast, numb fingers prying open the metal casing, reconnecting severed wires. Sand stuck to his hands, slipping into glove seams, but he didn't stop. Silra kept watch, her golden eyes scanning the red haze, her hand gripping a small metal shard she'd scavenged from the debris. Every sound, wind hissing, sand falling, made Elias's heart race, but he focused, wiring the secondary circuit, checking each connection. After 10 tense minutes, the panel lit up, a faint green glow pulsing with life. Elias plugged in the energy stick, hearing a soft hum. "It's ready," he said, his voice rough but steady. Silra stepped forward, her trembling hands opening the device, plugging it into the data port. A green flash sparked, and the data began transmitting, each byte carrying her hope. But then, a deafening blast rang out, sharp as thunder. Elias felt a searing pain in his leg, collapsing as blood soaked through his armor, hot against his cold skin. A mercenary, hidden in the shadows behind a rock, stepped forward, his energy rifle still smoking. "Hand over the device!" he roared, his voice distorted through his helmet. Silra shouted, lunging to drag Elias behind the panel, sand spraying around them. She gripped the metal shard, her golden eyes blazing, not with fear, but with defiance. The attacker advanced, raising his rifle, but Silra was faster. She drove the shard into his arm, hard enough to make him drop the weapon, screaming in pain. "Run!" she yelled, pulling Elias up, though his legs screamed with every movement. He leaned on her, blood trailing into the sand, as they fled into the red haze, leaving the burning relay behind. Flames licked the steel tower, the green glow of the data still flickering, like an unbroken promise. But the sound of the mercenaries' boots echoed closer, like Clyro's Four's ghosts chasing them into the dark. They hid in a small cave, red sand veiling the entrance like a fragile curtain against the outside world. The light from Clyro's Four's twin suns seeped through cracks, illuminating rough stone walls coated in red dust, like dried blood. Elias sat against a rocky outcrop, teeth gritted, hands trembling as he bandaged his leg wound. The bleeding had stopped, but every movement was a sharp stab, as if Clyro's Four were reminding him that no one left this planet without paying a price. He tore a strip from his jacket, tying it tightly around the wound, sweat rolling down his forehead despite the bone-deep cold. Silra knelt beside him, her golden eyes glowing but darkened, like a starry sky shrouded by clouds. She clutched a bloodied metal shard from the mercenary, her fingers tight, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "They'll come back," Elias said, his voice hoarse, eyes scanning the cave's entrance, where sand trickled with every strong gust. He didn't need to look at Silra to know what she was thinking. Those armored figures, the hunters, weren't scavengers but trained mercenaries, paid to kill. Silra nodded, her gaze fixed on the entrance, as if she could see through the sand to their enemies. "Not just mercenaries," she said, her voice low, cold but trembling at the end, as if forcing herself to face a painful truth. "Someone from my research team. They sold me out." Elias froze, a chill spreading through him, not from the cave's cold but from her words. He stopped bandaging, looking straight at her, her golden eyes now like twin blades, sharp but cracked. "Who?" he asked, his voice low, not out of curiosity but as a demand, as if the name would change everything. Silra took a deep breath, her fingers digging into the metal shard, knuckles whitening. "Kale," she said, the name like a curse. "The research team leader. He knew about the biological network from the start. He was the first to analyze my data, the first to see its potential. But he didn't want it shared. He wanted to sell it to the mining corporation, to let them monopolize it, to choke other planets with their grip. When I objected, when I said we had to release the data, he put me on a death list." Her revelation hit Elias like a blow to the chest, stealing his breath. Not just a corporate plot, not just faceless mercenaries. Silra's own teammate, someone she trusted, had betrayed her, turning her into prey in Clyro's Four's red sands. He looked at her, seeing the pain in her golden eyes, not tears, but a deeper wound, like a scar that would never heal. "He left you to die," Elias said, not a question but a confirmation, his voice heavy. Silra nodded, her gaze dropping, her hand instinctively touching the device in her pack. "He didn't just leave me to die. He erased the team, those who supported me, who believed in the data. I was the only one who escaped, but not because I was strong. Because I was lucky." Elias stayed silent, letting her words settle in the cave's cold air. He checked his survival pack, pulling out Silra's device, carefully inspecting its gleaming surface. It was unharmed, not a scratch, but the signal from the previous relay hadn't been confirmed. The explosion might have severed the link. "We need another relay," he said, his voice firm, though the pain in his leg reminded him each step would be a trial. There's a secondary one west, in the canyon. It's riskier, near the old mining zone, full of broken drones and corporate traps. But if it's active, we have a shot. He looked at her, expecting hesitation, but there was none. Silra nodded, her golden eyes bright again, no longer shadowed. I trust you, she said, her words simple but heavy, like a vow, as if she were placing her life in his hands. They left the cave, red sand clinging to their boots, the wind lashing their faces, carrying the scent of metal and smoke from the burned relay. Elias led, his left leg dragging, each step soaking the bandage with blood, but he gritted his teeth, hiding the pain from Silra. She followed, the metal shard in hand, her golden eyes scanning every shadow, like a beacon in the storm. The western canyon was 5 miles away, a trek through towering dunes and jagged rocks, where a single misstep could bury them. Elias checked his goggles, ensuring they shielded his face, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The footprints in the sand, the armored figures, they hadn't given up, and now he knew it wasn't just mercenaries hunting them. Kale, the betrayer, was out there somewhere, leading the pack, with a new team of better equipped, deadlier mercenaries. Each step was a defiance of Clyro's four, of the cold, the sand, and the forces seeking to bury the truth. Elias glanced at Silra, seeing her grip the device in her pack, her golden eyes unwavering. She was more than a biologist, more than a victim. She was the flame the corporation wanted to snuff out, and Elias, despite his pain and exhaustion, was determined not to let that flame die. They pressed westward, red sand filling their tracks, but unable to erase their resolve. In the darkness, the wind's howl carried Kale's laughter, closer, sharper, as if he'd caught the scent of blood. The secondary relay station lay deep in the canyon, surrounded by towering red stone pillars standing like silent giants guarding Clyro's four secrets. Elias and Silra reached it at dawn, the light from the twin suns bathing the canyon in a blazing red sea, as if the planet burned with rage. Elias limped forward, his left leg throbbing, dried blood crusting the makeshift bandage, but he didn't stop. Silra walked beside him, her golden eyes scanning every shadow, her hand clutching the pack with the device like an anchor keeping her from sinking into despair. The signal relay loomed ahead, a rusted steel tower tilting precariously, but its control panel glowed faintly, like the pulse of a machine not yet dead. Yet as they drew closer, signs of devastation hit them, deep boot prints in the sand, spent energy casings glinting in the red light, and a body sprawled face down beside the station, its white coat torn, long hair matted with sand and blood. Silra froze, her breath catching. She knelt, trembling hands touching the figure's shoulder, turning the body over. The pale face, eyes wide but lifeless, belonged to a young woman, no older than 30. Tara, Silra whispered, her voice breaking, the name a blade slicing into her heart. She stayed to help me. She tried to keep the data safe. They killed her. The pain in her voice was a tidal wave, sweeping Elias along. He clenched his fists, helplessness rising, but he refused to let it win. He gripped Silra's shoulder, gentle but firm, pulling her to her feet. We won't let her death be for nothing, he said, his voice low, eyes locking onto her golden gaze. Get inside. We finish this. Silra nodded, wiping a rare tear from her cheek, and followed him into the station, leaving Tara behind, a reminder of the cost of truth. Inside, the air was frigid, the acrid smell of burned metal clinging to every surface. Elias barred the door, the metal clanging, but he knew it would only delay, not stop, their enemies. He knelt by the control panel, hands brushing over tangled cables and a cracked screen. It's still operational, he muttered, opening his tool pack, starting to reconnect severed circuits. Silra stood beside him, plugging her device into the data port, a green light flickering, slow but steady. 3 minutes to complete the upload, she said, her voice taut, hands trembling but precise. Elias worked fast, sweat rolling down his face despite the cold turning his breath to mist. Every creak of metal, every howl of wind outside, made his heart race. They had no time, no real weapons, just a pistol scavenge from the previous mercenary, with 3 rounds left. When the upload reached 2/3, an explosion shook the canyon, strong enough to send sand cascading from the ceiling. Elias fell against the panel, clutching his wounded leg. Through the dust-caked window, he saw 5 mercenaries in black armor, their gear glinting, and one figure in the center, unarmored, his voice booming through a loudspeaker, smooth and cold. "Silra!" he called, his voice slithering like a snake through the sand. "Hand over the device, or you both die." Elias glanced at Silra, seeing her grip the device, her golden eyes blazing but laced with pain. "You know him?" he asked, voice low. She nodded, lips pressed tight. "Kale. He was my friend, the one I trusted most. Now he's just a greedy traitor, sold to the corporation." Elias checked the pistol, knowing 3 rounds wouldn't hold off an entire squad. But the data had to be sent. It was Silra's hope, Terra's sacrifice, the reason so many had died. An idea sparked, reckless but their only chance. "I'll draw them off," he said, meeting Silra's eyes. "You finish the upload. Don't stop, no matter what." Silra shook her head, grabbing his arm, her golden eyes wide with worry. "You can't, I have to." Elias cut her off, his voice firm. "Terra believed in you. So do I, don't let us down." Before she could protest, he flung open the station door, charging out, pistol in hand. Red sand sprayed under Elias's boots as he fired the first shot, hitting a mercenary's shoulder. The man collapsed, but the others returned fire, energy bolts sizzling past, melting sand into glass. Elias rolled behind a rock, his legs screaming, but he shouted, drawing their fire. "Kale! Want the device? Come get it!" He fired the second shot, clipping another mercenary's leg, making him scream. Inside the station, Silra worked frantically, hands shaking but precise, eyes glued to the screen. The upload hit 90%, then 95%. The blasts and gunfire outside made she flinch, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to stop. 10 seconds left, she muttered, fingers flying over the panel. When the upload finished, a green flash erupted, the data soaring into space, spreading to distant space stations. Silra grabbed the station's comm, shouting into the mic, her voice echoing through the canyon. "The data's out! You've lost!" Outside, Kale roared, his face twisting behind his transparent visor. "Kill them!" he ordered, pointing at the station. The mercenaries advanced, their rifles blazing, sand and rock shattering under the barrage. Elias, behind his rock, fired the final round, hitting a mercenary's chest, but he knew he couldn't hold out long. His leg bled, his breath labored, and Kale, with a cold smile, was closing in, like a predator sensing a weakened prey. But inside, Silra stood tall, her golden eyes blazing, device in hand, ready to fight, even with just a metal shard. The data was sent, but their battle, under Clyros IV's red stars, had only begun. The canyon burned under the red glow of the twin suns, red sand swirling as the mercenaries advanced, their energy rifles firing bolts that melted stone. Elias crouched behind his rock, breath ragged, his left leg oozing blood through the bandage, each heartbeat a stab of pain. Silra was inside the station, the green glow of the control panel flickering, the data sent, but Kale and his squad pressed on. Elias gripped the empty pistol, now just a useless hunk of metal. He peered through a crack in the rock, seeing Kale amid his men, a cold smile visible through his transparent visor, like a predator certain of its kill. All seemed lost, as if Clyros IV had decided to swallow them, leaving only red sand as their grave. Then a piercing screech tore through the sky, like the roar of a machine coming alive. A small ship, its hull scarred with burn marks, dove from the red clouds, firing 2 precise energy blasts that dropped 2 mercenaries in an instant. Sand sprayed, the explosion shaking the canyon. A voice boomed from the ship's speakers, strong and familiar. "Voss, get down!" Elias froze, his heart pounding, as if the past had come alive. It was Mira, the freelance pilot he'd flown with 7 years ago, who he thought died in the war when her ship was shot down in a dogfight beyond the asteroid belt. He ducked, sand whipping over his head, as the ship landed, red dust swirling like a miniature storm. The hatch opened, and Mira stepped out, her short hair singed, her old pilot's armor battered but her eyes sharp as knives. She led a small team, 4 people, 2 scientists in dirty white coats, 2 freelance pilots with rifles, all carrying the grit of those who lived beyond the law. Mira knelt beside Elias, checking his wound, her eyes a mix of anger and worry. "Thought you were dead, Voss," she said, her tone joking but tense. "Alive and letting yourself get this bad?" Before Elias could respond, Silra burst from the station, her golden eyes blazing, clutching the device. Mira looked at her, recognition sparking. "You're Silra? We caught your first signal from the old relay. Your data's spreading across space stations, from Alara to Vion 7. But Kale's got corporate backing. We need to get off Clyros now, before they call reinforcements." Silra nodded, but her eyes stayed on the mercenaries regrouping 100 meters away. Kale, standing among them, activated a small device, purple light pulsing, and Myra's ship's signal faltered, the cockpit screens going dark. "He's jamming us," Mira cursed, signaling her team to take positions. "Signal's down, we can't lift off until we disable it." The mercenaries' gunfire erupted, energy bolts searing past, melting sand into glass. Elias, despite his leg, grabbed a metal rod from the debris, ready to fight, but Silra pulled him back, her golden eyes fierce. "We need my device safe," she whispered. "Let me handle Kale." But Kale was faster. In the chaos, he slipped through the sand, charging into the station, and before anyone could react, he grabbed Silra, pressing a gun to her head. "Hand over the original device!" he roared, his voice distorted through his helmet, eyes wild. Myra's team aimed their rifles, but no one dared shoot, fearing for Silra. Elias, hidden behind a rock, felt blood rush to his head, but he didn't act blindly. He crept around, dragging his leg through the sand, each step agony, but he didn't stop. He remembered the station's control panel, an old, half-broken power core that could still cause havoc if triggered wrong. Elias slipped into the station through a crack, hands trembling as he pried open the panel's casing. Kale was still shouting, his gun pressed to Silra's head, oblivious to Elias. "You thought you could beat me?" Kale sneered, his voice smooth but venomous. "Your data will belong to the corporation, and I'll be the one calling the shots." Silra, pinned, her golden eyes unwavering. "You chose wrong, Kale," she said, her voice icy. "You sold us all." Her words startled Kale, and that was Elias's chance. He activated the power core, bypassing the stabilizer, overloading it. A small explosion erupted, smoke and sparks flying, throwing Kale off balance, staggering. Silra acted instantly. She broke free, slamming her fist into Kale's face, cracking his visor. She snatched the device from his hand, her golden eyes blazing like fire. Kale roared, lunging, but Silra stood tall, metal shard in hand, ready to fight. "He's not worth killing," she said, her voice cold, eyes locked on Kale, now kneeling in the sand, blood dripping from his nose. "He'll live to see his failure." Elias, gasping, pulled her from the station, smoke rising behind them. Mira and her team laid down covering fire, pushing back the remaining mercenaries, clearing a path to the ship. As they boarded, Kale stood, eyes wild, but he didn't pursue. He knew the data had spread, his defeat inevitable. Myra's ship shuddered, engines roaring, lifting off through the red sand. Elias, sitting beside Silra, watched her clutch the device, her golden eyes now brighter, not with pain but with hope. Mira, from the cockpit, turned back, flashing a wry smile. "Not done yet, you two. The corporation will come for us." But Elias didn't care. He looked at Silra, saw her nod slightly, a silent vow to fight on, together. Under Clyros 4's red stars, they'd survived, and that was their first victory. Myra's ship roared as it lifted off, its engines pulsing like the heartbeat of a living machine, tearing through Clyros 4's red sand veil. Through the cabin window, Elias looked down, watching the planet shrink, its sand valleys and stone pillars like vast scars, remnants of greed and abandonment. 7 years on this world, he thought he'd die in the sand, forgotten like the wrecked ships. But now, he sat here, his leg bandaged, dried blood crusting the cloth, his breath still heavy but carrying a new feeling, not just survival, but life. Silra sat beside him, her golden eyes blazing, clutching the small device, its silver circuits glinting like a captive star. She checked its tiny screen, numbers dancing, confirming her data had reached 67 space stations, spreading through interstellar networks like wildfire on dry grass. "They can't bury it anymore," she said, her voice relieved, no longer sharp but soft, like a rare breeze free of sand. Elias watched her, seeing the faint white scars on her hands, marks of Clyro's 4's gnawing, but also the light in her eyes, like the stars he'd once gazed at through a ship's telescope as an engineer. "You did it," he said, his voice hoarse, not to comfort but to acknowledge. Silra shook her head, her golden eyes locking onto his, unflinching. "We did it," she corrected, her voice firm, as if every step through the sand, every dodged bullet, every second they survived, was a shared triumph. Her words warmed Elias's chest, a strange sensation after 7 years of knowing only the cold of metal and sand. He didn't reply, just nodded, but the corner of his mouth twitched, a small smile, the first in 7 years, not for surviving another day, but for feeling truly alive, truly meaningful. From the cockpit, Mira turned, her short hair a mess, her grin wide but her eyes still sharp as knives. "I like this duo," she said, her tone teasing but tinged with pride. "But don't think it's over. The corporation won't let this slide. Your data's costing them billions, and they'll hunt us, from here to the galaxy's edge." She tapped the control panel, the screen flickering, displaying a star map with dozens of glowing dots, stations that had received Silra's data. Elias looked at the screen, seeing the lights spread, like flames no one could extinguish, and he knew Mira was right. This victory was just the first step, and its price would be days of running, fighting, and perhaps blood. Silra took Elias's hand, her touch cold but steady, her fingers lacing with his like a vow without words. "They can hunt," she said, her voice low but resolute, her golden eyes blazing, no longer with fear but with defiance. "But we're not running anymore." Her words swept through the cabin like a breeze, banishing the cold, filling Elias with a new strength, not from his body but from his will. He squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses on his palm brush against her smooth, scarred skin. "No more running," he echoed, his voice deep, and this time, his smile was clearer, no longer a fleeting spark but a small flame, burning in the darkness of his lonely years. In the cabin, the air still reeked of metal and smoke, but a new stillness settled, not of death but of life. Myra's team, 2 scientists and 2 freelance pilots, sat in the back, murmuring about Silra's data, about how it could revolutionize energy, freeing planets from the corporation's grip. One scientist, an older man with silver hair, looked at Silra with awe. "You've done what hundreds in the Alliance wouldn't dare dream," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Your biological network, it's the future." Silra didn't respond, just nodded, her golden eyes dropping to the device in her hands, as if seeing her fallen teammates, Terra, the others, who'd paid the price for this data's freedom. Elias leaned back in his seat, his body aching, but his mind clearer than ever. He thought of Clyro's 4, the days wandering through sand, the nights he thought he'd never see dawn. He'd once believed survival was everything, but now, sitting beside Silra, he realized survival was just the start. To live, truly live, was to fight for something greater than himself. He watched her check the device again, her slender fingers brushing its gleaming surface, her golden eyes focused but softened, as if she too sensed a change within herself. Mira broke his thoughts from the cockpit. "We're headed to Alara 9, she shouted over the engine's roar. "Green colony safe, at least for now. Rest up, you two. More battles ahead." Elias nodded, but his eyes stayed on Silra. She looked up, her golden gaze meeting his, and in that moment, no words were needed, they understood each other. They'd survived Clyro's 4, Kale, and death itself. The corporation might hunt them, but they were no longer prey. They were flames, and no matter how dark the sky, they'd burn bright, together. Myra's ship touched down on Alara 9, its roaring engines fading into a gentle silence Elias hadn't known in his 7 years on Clyros 4. The hatch opened, and a cool, clean breeze swept in, carrying the scent of fresh grass and damp soil, untainted by the burn of metal or red sand. Elias stepped out, his left leg still aching, but each step on the colony's soft ground felt like a reminder that he'd left behind the scarred, crimson planet. Silra walked beside him, her golden eyes sweeping over the sprawling fields of grass under a pale blue sky, where white clouds drifted slowly, like unhurried dreams. She took a deep breath, her chest rising, as if she were truly breathing for the first time. Elias watched her, catching the slight curve of her lips, a small, radiant smile, like sunlight breaking through Clyros's dust. A group of scientists awaited them at the landing pad, their white coats fluttering in the breeze, their eyes a mix of awe and excitement. Their leader, an older woman with silver hair tied tightly back, stepped forward, clasping Silra's hand with rare sincerity. "Your data has changed everything," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Clyros's biological network is now shared across the Planetary Alliance. It's being studied at 112 space stations, from Alara to the Outer Rim. You've given us a new future." Silra nodded, her golden eyes dropping to the small device in her hand, as if it still held the souls of her fallen teammates, Terra, the others. "Not just me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Everyone who believed in it." Elias stood beside her, silent, but he felt the weight of her words, the weight of the sacrifices that had brought them here. They were given a small house on the colony's edge, simple but warm, with smooth wooden walls and large windows overlooking the grassy fields. It held no luxuries, just an old wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a soft wool blanket, but to Elias, it was a world apart from the rusted cabin on Clyros 4. Silra, for the first time since he'd met her, shed his thermal jacket, revealing a thin, patched shirt, the faint white scars on her arms like dried riverbeds. She stepped into the backyard, a small plot of rich black soil, and knelt, digging a small hole. From her pack, she pulled a seed, a relic from the Clyros research station, a spark of life from that harsh world. She planted it, patting the soil carefully, and when a green sprout emerged days later, she smiled, a radiant smile, like sunlight on the fields. Elias stood beside her, watching, his heart lightening, as if her smile were a sprout taking root in him. One afternoon, Elias walked to a roadside stall, where a cheerful man sold hot tea from old copper kettles. He bought 2 cups, simply because he could, a small, extravagant act after years of ration bars and nutrient fluid. He returned, handing one to Silra, the tea's warmth sending mist curling into the cool air. They sat together on the wooden steps, saying little, but the silence was now a gift, not a burden. The breeze carried the rustle of grass, and Elias felt a peace he thought lost forever. Silra sipped her tea, her golden eyes gazing at the fields, where small birds swooped, tracing soft arcs in the sky. "I never thought I'd see a place like this," she said, her voice quiet but brimming with emotion. "Not after Clyros." That night, in their small room, the glow of an oil lamp cast gentle shadows on the wooden walls. Silra leaned against Elias, her head resting on his shoulder, her long black hair spilling like a river of night. Her fingers traced absent circles on his arm, brushing the old scars from his days as a ship engineer, from explosions and red sand. "I thought I'd never belong anywhere again," she said, her voice a whisper, as if sharing a secret with herself. "After losing my team, after the betrayal, I thought I was just a ghost in the sand." Elias leaned down, kissing her forehead, feeling the warmth of her skin, no longer cold as stone as it had been when he first touched her. "You belong here," he said, his voice low, certain. "With me." His words weren't poetic, but they carried the weight of 7 lonely years, of days he thought he'd never find a reason to live. They lay on the bed, hands clasped, Silra's fingers cold but steady, like a vow without words. Elias pulled the wool blanket over her shoulders, listening to her even breathing, and for the first time in 7 years, he slept without fear, without dreams of red sand or howling winds. Outside, the grassy fields rustled under the moonlight, and Silra's small tree stood quietly, its green sprout reaching up, a reminder that even from sand, life could grow. The little house, with its oil lamp and their shared breaths, was a new world, not perfect, but enough to call home. In Alaranine's gentle darkness, Elias and Silra found each other, not just as survivors, but as people who belonged, in a place where hope was not just a dream, but reality. A month passed on Alaranine, time flowing like a calm river, washing away memories of Clyros IV's red sand and screaming winds. Elias and Silra began building a new life in their small house, where sunlight streamed through wooden windows, illuminating a simple dining table and the small potted plants Silra tended daily. The Clyro seed, now taller, its vibrant green leaves stretching under the pale blue sky, stood as a symbol of unyielding life. Elias, with hands calloused from years as a ship engineer, learned to patch the roof, plant vegetables in the garden, and even smile more, his smiles no longer fleeting sparks but part of him. Silra, her golden eyes blazing, spent hours reading books from the colony's library, scribbling notes on ecosystems, as if repaying the planet that gave her a second chance. But despite the peace, both knew, the corporation's shadow still loomed, like a distant storm yet to arrive. One morning, as Elias brewed 2 cups of tea from an old copper kettle, a faint beep sounded from a small control panel in the corner. Silra, seated at the table with her gleaming device, looked up, her golden eyes flashing with curiosity. "Encrypted message," she said, her fingers gliding over the screen. Elias set the cups down, stepping closer, the familiar tension from Clyros IV creeping back, like an itching scar. Silra entered the code, and Myra's voice crackled through, brief but sharp. "Check your device. There's something you haven't seen. Be careful, the corporation's still watching." The message ended, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Elias glanced at Silra, seeing her eyes shift from curiosity to resolve, like a flame flaring in the dark. Silra placed the device on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she opened its interface, scrolling through the files sent to 112 space stations. She searched, her golden eyes focused, slender fingers dancing over the gleaming surface. Then she stopped, her breath catching. "A hidden file," she whispered, opening it. The screen lit up, revealing not just the Clyros biological network data, but a map, a network of coordinates leading to an uncharted planet beyond the Alliance's rim, where readings suggested a biological network stronger, more complex than Clyros's. The map rotated slowly, blue light bathing Silra's face, making her golden eyes glow like twin stars. "Terra left it," she whispered, her voice breaking, tears rolling down her cheeks, not of grief, but of awe. "She knew. She encoded it before she died, for me to find." Elias stood beside her, staring at the map, its glowing points like promises yet to be fulfilled. He thought of Terra, the young woman dead in the sand, who'd sacrificed herself to protect Silra's data. "She gave us a chance," he said, his voice low, his hand resting lightly on Silra's shoulder. "Not just to live, but to change everything." Silra nodded, wiping her tears, her golden eyes brighter than ever, as if seeing not just the map, but the future. "This planet, if its network is stronger than Clyros's, it could power hundreds of colonies, without mining, without war. It could be the answer to everything we've lost." Elias sat beside her, looking at the map then at her. "We going?" he asked, his voice light but heavy with the weight of a vow. He knew the journey would be perilous. The corporation was still hunting them, and an uncharted planet could hold threats even Clyros IV couldn't match. But after 7 years of survival and these days with Silra, he knew he didn't want a safe life on Alaraniine. He wanted to fight, to build, to leave a mark. Silra turned to him, her golden eyes locking onto his, and she smiled, truly radiant for the first time, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Together," she said, her voice certain, her hand grasping his, her fingers cold but warmed by resolve. They began preparing, not rushed but resolute. Elias checked the comms, sending an encrypted message to Mira, asking about a ship strong enough to cross the rim. Silra packed the data, adding new notes, and tended her seedling in the garden, as if leaving a piece of herself on Alara 9. They spoke with the colony's scientists, who vowed to protect Silra's data and continue studying the biological network. One evening, as moonlight bathed the grassy fields, Elias and Silra sat on the steps, sipping tea, watching the seedling grow taller. "We're not just going to find a planet," Silra said, her voice dreamy. "We're going to make sure no one's left behind in the sand, like I was." Elias nodded, squeezing her hand. "And we'll do it," he said, his voice low, carrying a certainty he'd never had on Clyros 4. They looked at the sky, where stars twinkled, no longer distant lights but destinations, possibilities. The small house on Alara 9, with its seedling and oil lamp, was where they began, but this new journey, to an unknown planet, was where they'd shape a future. Elias thought of Terra, of Silra's fallen teammates, of the days they fought in the sand. He looked at Silra, her golden eyes blazing, not just with a biologist's light, but with the spark of hope. They would go, not just to live, but to ensure the future wasn't red sand, but green fields, where everyone could belong.